Right, so we're back, and we will continue where we left off, exploring the principle that theme is chosen as an adaptation to the method of development of the text. And this means both reflecting the method of development and actually constructing it through thematic choices. These thematic choices involve all three kinds of theme, potentially textual, interpersonal, and topical. But for now, I will give illustrations that foreground the alternate choices of topical themes to key into, as it were, the method of development. So for this stage, we will focus on themes selected according to method of development of a text, and we'll move from a story to a taxonomic report to maximize contrast in possible methods of development. So themes selected according to method of development of a text. Let's pick up the diagram that shows the maximal number of themes, textual, interpersonal, and topical. But we'll focus, as I said, for now, on topical theme. And what I would like to illustrate to begin with, before we look at whole text, is a difference between topical theme selected in a passage of text, where the method of development is one of contrast, and another where is one of temporal process or temporal sequence. So we are actually looking at the experiential environment and the orientation towards the method of development in that experiential environment. So here is an example of a passage of text where a contrast is the local method of development. So it reads, some readers will never look at the dogs the same way. Others will look at the dogs and say, I knew it, with the assurance that dogs understand exactly what I mean. Now, how is this contrast signaled by the grammar? Well, it's signaled precisely by making the points of contrast, some readers, others, topical themes. Okay, so it's not necessary to say in contrast, because the contrast can be inferred between the points of contrast, some readers and other readers. Okay, so that's an example of theme selection to bring out the method of development, in this case, the method of development of contrast. So that's one example. Let's now take another example where the local method of development is not contrast but temporal sequence. And this comes from a historical recount. It's called A Story of Australia, but it's really a recount of Australian history. And this little passage of text is organized as a temporal sequence. And if you look at each little paragraph, I've underlined in blue temporal expressions. So these are temporal expressions that have been given the status of theme. And that's enough, in a sense, to infer that there is a chronological method of development. So in 1606, later in the 1600s, in 1642. These are all topical themes, and they're periods of time, and we can infer that the relationship is then. So in other words, the method of development is sequenced in time, and the themes are chosen to allow us to infer the different periods in the sequence in time. So the examples so far have been of the textual significance of beginnings of narrative context, the choices of moves, readers, etc., viewers into stories. Let me now switch to another example, and we'll examine a little bit more of the text, starting at the beginning. Again, a traditional folk tale. So these are retelling of a folk tale from Puerto Rico, in English, The Legend of the Hummingbird King. It's a picture book for children, and this is the first spread. As you would expect by now, the macro theme, as it were, is in terms of the context of narration, the placement, so the orientation to the whole story. And you remember this from the last segment, this example. High in the mountains lived a daughter of a chief. Her name was Alida, and her tribe was the Taínos. Okay, so that's the placement. And as far as the whole text, the whole story is concerned, folktale, this is the beginning of the macro theme. Then it continues, Alida's favorite place, sparkling water, etc., right? And if we consider this in relation to the whole folktale, these two orthographic paragraphs constitute the placement, the macro theme for the whole text. So high in the mountains lived, the trees kept Alida's special place hidden. Then that's signaled very clearly in the next paragraph by a temporal theme initiating event. One day, while Alida was at the hidden pool, she was surprised by a visitor, a boy about her own age. The boy joined Alida on the rocks. So if we read this passage of 3 paragraphs, just paying attention to those elements that have been given a status of theme, what we get is something like this. High in the mountains, her name, her tribe, Alida's favorite place, all around the pool, the trees, one day, while Alida, the boy. That is the thematic orientation that runs through. But interestingly, it works together with the material that's introduced in the remainder of the message, so the non-theme or the rime. And we're trying to show this to you by building it up stage by stage. So what we're asking is, how has the writer, the storyteller, how is he or she guiding the development of the text for the readers or the listeners? So high in the mountains lived the daughter of a chief. High in the mountains, that's our first theme. Then within that, a new character is introduced, the daughter of a chief. Now this character then becomes available, as it were, as a possible candidate for further theme selection. So the daughter of a chief, and this can now be elaborated, picked up. Her name was Alida. And then further detail about her. Her tribe was the Taínos. So you see the move from high in the mountains, the setting in space, introducing a main character, and then some characteristics, some features, some attribute of her in the next few themes. Okay? Name and tribe. Alida's favorite place. That was the next theme. And then within that message, within the rime, the sparkling waterfall that tumbled into a small pool. Now, a small pool has been introduced, and that means it's, as it were, on the list of candidates to be explored further thematically, and that's exactly what happens. Okay, so all around the pool were rocks and trees. Rocks and tall trees. Now, within that message, relative to the theme all around the pool, we have within the non-theme, the rime, tall trees. And tall trees now becomes a candidate for further elaboration. And that's exactly what happens in the next message. The trees kept Alida's special place hidden. So that's a typical example of a very carefully staged, guided development of a sequence in a text using the resources of the system of theme. And you can see, as I've already suggested, the complementarity of what gets treated as theme orientation and then introduced relative to that orientation. And once something is introduced, it becomes, in turn, a possible candidate for a thematic elaboration. Now, if you look at the whole passage, there is a kind of movement from high in the mountains to Alida's special place. So it's not just the local selections of theme, message by message, but also within the whole sequence. One way of displaying such an analysis is just in a tabular form. You tabulate theme and reme. That can be helpful if you're scanning for patterns. So, for example, here, high in the mountains, her name, her tribe, Alida's favorite place, all around the pool, the trees, one day. And by tabulating in this way, you quickly see that this change in the temporal setting from general time, as it were, to particular time, one day, stands out. And that's, in fact, the initiating event in what will then propel the story forward. So tabulating the analysis of clause's message, clause by clause, in this way can be helpful. You can bring out patterns. Another way of showing the analysis is by way of box diagram. And we've looked at box diagrams before. Box diagrams can be very helpful too, and they can help us see how the different strands of metafunctional meaning, the different metafunctional strands, are woven together. So by just looking at it clause by clause, box diagram by box diagram, we can see, for example, that Alida's favorite place, it's theme, certainly, but it's also subject, and it's something that's identified in the identifying relational clause in the experiential strand. So this is how it works if you just leaf through this picture book for children. The first spread, beginning of the placement. Second spread, continuing of the placement. But then the initiating event one day. And again, this is typical of traditional stories, this resetting to a specific time where the story can begin to be propelled forward. So the story continues, and it's a bit of a Romeo and Juliet story. It has a sad character, so I'll leave it at here, and we will turn to something more joyful, if you think this is more joyful. Now, this folktale that's narrating, so time is important, main characters are important. The organization is overall in terms of events, sequence in time, an event line, and it's imaginary. Let's turn to a kind of text that is designed to construct knowledge for its readers, expand knowledge about some general domain of phenomena. And one very typical one is a taxonomic report, often met early in the school years for children when they move into formal educational construction of knowledge. So this is one of the old-time favorites. It's a book about dinosaurs, and there's a little entry on Teratosaurus, a taxonomic report on Teratosaurus. So it says, Teratosaurus was one of the early meat-eating dinosaurs. Its head was much bigger than the head of Plateosaurus. Teratosaurus had strong jaws and sharp teeth of a hunter. Its hind legs were long and powerful, so Teratosaurus must have stood on two legs. And here you have a specimen of Teratosaurus. In terms of the theme choices, we can track it. So we ask which elements of this text are given thematic status. Well, the first is Teratosaurus, including this non-IPA guide to the pronunciation. Its head, Teratosaurus. Its hind legs, so Teratosaurus. So you see there is a kind of switch between the whole creature, Teratosaurus, and body parts. Its head, its hind legs. And if you examine this a little bit more carefully and you think about how would you integrate the information from the pictorial representation of Teratosaurus and the verbal representation, you can actually see that the selection of themes, is quite helpful. So it starts with Teratosaurus, and that's an indication that you scan the whole creature. Then it moves from the whole creature to body part, its head. And if you turn to the image of Teratosaurus, then you have a guidance that you focus on the head in viewing it. Then you return to the whole creature, more about the body parts. Teratosaurus had strong jaws and sharp teeth of a hunter. Okay, so we're talking about the creature as a whole. And then it switches back to one particular body part. Its hind legs were long and powerful. Okay? So if you maintain this scanning or reading of text and scanning of image, you can track it through the theme selections. And then finally, again, about the whole creature. So Teratosaurus must have stood on 2 legs. Again, the theme signals that we now take in, we scan the whole image of the creature. As in the display of the analysis of the folktale, we can simply tabulate the successive clauses, theme plus reme. So we can scan for patterns. Teratosaurus, its head. Teratosaurus, its hind legs. So Teratosaurus. To help us see what's going on, this switch between the whole creature and body parts, we can separate them into columns. So it's just that the theme alternates between the whole and the body part. Teratosaurus, its head. Teratosaurus, its hind legs. So Teratosaurus. And I say this because it's important to support our sort of making mileage out of the analysis we create when we analyze a text grammatically. So we want to get so much support as possible to interpret the results of the analysis. Next, we will look at some further examples of theme selections in different types of text. Again, with the explicit understanding that different kinds of text operate with different methods of development, and these different methods of development are both reflected in and created by theme selections.